All right. Hey, everybody. Started a couple minutes early so that I could go ahead and get everybody onto our call today. So, welcome to another installment in our Fireside Chat series. Gonna go ahead and add my co-host, Funk, and our special guest today. So, in case you haven't been following us lately, our guest that we're going to be chatting with today is Dr. Joanna Harper. And we're going to be talking to her about her research history and the general state of the literature on trans happening and hopefully going to be happening in the future. Yeah, we're going to go ahead and get started and try to stay on time as best we can. Siu Feng, my co-host, and I are very excited we get to talk to Dr. Joanna Harper today. So just a quick introduction for anybody who doesn't know who Joanna is. She just finished earning her PhD in exercise science this year in January. And I don't want to mispronounce the university. I think it's pronounced Loughborough, right?
Loughborough,
Loughborough? Okay.
Lough, like slough.
Oh, okay. So Loughborough University in England, and she is now currently a postdoctoral scholar at Oregon Health and Science University back here in the United States. So um, I don't know that much about the field, but I personally feel like you're one of, if not like the pioneer on research on trans athletes in exercise science. And you've built on kind of the research that initially, popularized this kind of like field in the rest of the world for those of us that aren't in touch with that research, and are now finished publishing, I believe, three more research papers. So two were in laboratory studies, and one was in online examination of athletic performance of trans athletes. And anyway, we're just very, very excited to chat with you, get to know a little bit more about your research history, your more recent research and the findings, and just in general, like what kind of that research field looks like and how it can be applied in the development of different regulations for incorporating trans athletes into sports at large. So thank you so much for your time and for just all of the work that you did trying to hop on the call and just everything. Thank you so much for everything.
Okay.
Yeah. So okay, so that I just wanted to give that quick intro, and then obviously y'all know my co-host Siu Feng, and I are both on the board of the International Association of Trans Bodybuilders and Powerlifters. And just in case you didn't know, we already have scheduled our first competition this year in November. It's going to be on November 23rd, so keep an eye out for details on that. And if you want to support us and support chats like this one, then definitely consider becoming a member. And there's instructions on how to do that on our Instagram feed. Okay, now that I got all that out of the way, I want to just hop right into the conversation. So we really want to start with getting a little bit of background about Joanna, your history, and what we found from your bio that you sent us is that before you specifically did exercise science, you originally got your undergraduate in physics and then your master's in medical physics. And Sifung and I wanted to know very briefly, like what that was, because we have never heard of medical physics as a concept. Um, and what got you from medical physics to then a PhD in exercise science, like how those maybe are related, or how you got from one to the other.
So, um, medical physics is an applied field rather than an academic field. And it's the field that applies the principles of physics to the very high-tech world of modern medicine. And medical physicists are generally employed by hospitals, most often in radiation oncology departments, where it's extremely important to make sure that people are getting the right amounts of radiation. So that's what I did as a career. And then after my transition, I guess I should back up. I've always been a fairly serious runner. When I was in my 20s, I ran a 2:23 marathon. And When I started my transition in 2004, within 9 months of starting hormone therapy, I was running 12% slower, and that's the difference between serious male and female distance runners. So 9 months of hormone therapy had caused me to lose my complete male advantage in the sport. So as a scientist, I was intrigued. I started to learn more about the endocrinology and the exercise physiology involved in explaining what happened to me. I also started very slowly to gather data from other trans women distance runners like me. It took a while, but in 2015, I published this tiny study of race times in 8 transgender distance runners. In any sort of normal sort of circumstances, this would be a very minor study, but this was the first study of its kind. So suddenly, off of the back of this one study, I found myself as the go-to expert in this field, just because nobody else had done anything. And so within months of publishing this study in 2015, I was helping the International Olympic Committee write policy. I had served as an expert witness for World Athletics in a case at the Court of Arbitration for Sport. I got several media requests. And then in 2018, Loughborough University in the UK contacted me and said they wanted to do physiology studies on trans athletes, and could I help them set up their program? I told them I wasn't qualified for that. I didn't have a PhD. And so their response was, well, why don't you come over and get one? So I did.
Sorry, I love that. Oh man,
So that's my story.
That was amazing. That is amazing to know. I'm Su Feng. I'm so happy to be here to be talking with you. And I have read, the 2015 article of yours. When I was writing a manuscript, thinking with the limited amount of really scientific research of trans women athletes, when there is so much accusation around trans women participating in the women's division in sports, right? And so your work was one of those really, really, I think, very original and very crucial, right, to the whole development of having science and evidence-based kind of research on trans women themselves. And so, I mean, following to what you have just talked about, I'm really curious about your latest research, right? That you are required to do for your PhD. And by the way, I'm also doing my PhD at Emory, and my PhD is more on thinking with the non-binary gender divisions in bodybuilding in particular in Taiwan. So I'm just very curious about your latest research. What are they about? Can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. But because we're looking to publish, you certainly understand I can't be giving you the results of these studies.
Yes.
But we have 2 lab-based studies. One's a longitudinal design where our goal was to get trans athletes into the sports lab before they started hormone therapy, do standard exercise tests to measure strength, size, speed, stamina, and then repeat those every 3 months for up to 2 years after the athletes started their gender-affirming hormone therapy. Sadly, there was a global pandemic going on, and we wound up only getting one athlete through 18 months of hormone therapy. She's an elite cyclist, and so we have data following her performance in the lab, and cyclists also monitor their progress through power meters on their bike. So we have both lab data and data from her power meter. We also have strength measurements on her over 18 months of hormone therapy. So that's one study. The second lab study was a cross-sectional design of lab study. And we brought in trans women athletes who had been on hormone therapy for at least 12 months, again, did standard exercise tests on them, and then brought in a matched group of cisgender women athletes and did the same tests on them and made comparisons. Again, I can't really tell you that the data, however, at the same time, there was another cross-sectional study that was going on, and it has just been published within this month, and those data are available. And so I can talk a little bit about what they published in terms of strength measurements. They did an upper body strength measurement, which was a hand grip study, and the trans women had higher absolute but not higher relative strength in hand grip study than the cis women. And if you're looking at absolute versus relative, it depends what activity you're looking at. In track and field, for instance, if you're looking at throwing, it's absolute strength that's more important. If you're looking at jumping, it's relative strength that's more important. And this shows up in the lower body test that they published, which was a jumping, counter movement jump is the official term of it. And the trans women didn't jump any higher than the cis women. And that's because you're using your lower body strength to lift your body off the ground. And so it's inherently a relative strength sort of measurement. There are also VO2 measurements in their published data, and the trans women did not have higher absolute VO2 max, and in fact had lower relative VO2 max.
Wow.
There's a study on non-athletes that was published that found that the trans women had higher absolute but not relative VO2 max. So there's a little difference in those two published studies. But relative VO2 is important, is the primary thing of importance if you're talking about running or endurance swimming. When you're looking at cycling, because you're not only moving your body, but you're moving a bike as well, then absolute VO2 becomes important as well. So that study is easily available. There's an article in the New York Times that would give you a link on it. Blair Hamilton, who is a transgender footballer or soccer player in the U.S. She's the first author, and Yanis Pitsalatis is the last author. And it's easy to find if you have access to PubMed. And I would certainly advise looking at that study. The third study that we did was a survey study similar to the first study that I published, except larger, where we looked at sports where you can look at results just by looking at numbers before and after. So we had runners, we had a swimmer, and we had one trans man power lifter in there. And I would love to get, on a personal basis, more data from trans men who are powerlifting and who powerlifted before transition. The gains in strength on this trans man were impressive, and I assume that many of you could also share some impressive strength gains that you have had. And I'd love to see more data like that. But those are the three studies. We're working on getting those published. That can take a while, but I would suspect that within a couple of years, we should have all three of those studies published.
That's
awesome. Yeah, that's really amazing to know. And I think I also read the one that you just mentioned that is recently published, right? This morning, actually. And I think, from what I understand is that it really depends on, what kind of sports you're looking into, right? That determines whether it is, which is more important, whether the absolute strength or relative strength, right, is
Mhm.
actually, or, more important, for each type of sport, right? So would you say, based on, the studies that you're doing as well, will you also be arguing that, or will you be also saying that, or agreeing that, actually different sports have a different requirement of whether it's strength or endurance, and so it is really hard to say, hard to have a blanket statement, right? Arguing that, trans people have advantage over all kinds of sports, based on, the numbers that you gather.
Yeah, the idea that there's some simple, overwhelming advantage that trans women have over cis women is certainly misguided. Trans women certainly have advantages,
Mhm.
but trans women on average are taller, bigger, and stronger than cis women. But there is increasing evidence that trans women are not pound for pound stronger, and so, for instance, in a sport like powerlifting, where you have weight classes, trans women won't be any bigger than the women in their weight class. And if if this finding of similar relative strength holds true, then again, compared to similar sized cis women, trans women may not be any stronger. So these things are important, and it is absolutely true that sports need to look at things on a sport by sport basis. Unfortunately, however, what that does is it does, when you turn things over to individual sports governing bodies, you also turn them over to the executive of these individual sports governing bodies. And the people who run the sports are also very different human beings with their own sets of prejudices, and or not. And so there can be large differences in the human beings who run these sports too, and that is a complication that also matters.
Yeah, I think actually that it jumps around to the last set of questions we have, Sifun, but I feel like that's a perfect segue. Do you want to ask about the question you had about different governing bodies and the IOC change in IOC policies? Because that seems right on the nose, or no? Do you want me to ask that, Sifun?
Oh, yes, yes. I thought you were going to ask it.
No, I was asking if you, because that was your question that you wanted to ask about the shift in the
Oh, yeah,
IOC
yeah.
policies.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, I can start the topic.
I
Yeah,
don't know.
I
It seems like
mean,
the perfect segue.
yeah. So when I was looking at the 2021 IOC guidelines, right? So that have that all this blank, almost like I would say, a kind of a blanket inclusiveness, right? That, and then it gives to, individual governing bodies, their own, priorities and rights to actually determine for their own sports, which is more important, how to determine fairness, how to determine, so-called integrity, right? In their own individual sport. And I think, and then looking into some of these international governing bodies, right? Just to say, track and field, of course, very recently as well, like swimming, and as well as I think rugby earlier on, right? And, other types of British sports as well. Very interestingly, that also, those governing bodies, what they're trying to do is, they seem to really impose even stricter, right? All these stricter transgender policy, which they claim to be inclusive in one way or the other, but then largely ban, trans women in particular, who have undergone so-called male puberty, right, in order to participate in the women's category. And so it seems to me that it looks like a loophole where the IOC becomes, the guidelines become less bounded, right, by the governing bodies, right, and actually allows a loophole where governing bodies could actually impose even stricter transgender policy. Then, in some sports, it's even stricter than that in the 2015, where the IOC have implemented, the HRT, kind of regulations. So I'm just curious about maybe your role, right? In the whole IOC kind of guidelines, right? The process of it, how was that for you, and what do you think of how these different governing bodies take up the IOC guidelines?
So I was part of the working group that came up with the 2015 IOC guidelines, but I was not part of the group that came up with the 2021 framework. I think that the framework is well intentioned. I think if you look at the 10 points, the fact that inclusion is the very first point, makes it very, very clear that the IOC values and prioritizes inclusive policies. But sadly, as you mentioned, that's not what has happened. And the IOC does explicitly state that each individual sport should be responsible for their own policies. And as I said, based on the science, that's an appropriate thing. But then you're turning over the decision-making power to to people who may not be very inclusive people, and so that's been the downfall of this, and so the IOC framework was very well intentioned. Clearly, they value inclusive policies, but it has resulted in some sadly exclusive policies, and the policies that suggest that only trans women who haven't experienced any testosterone-fueled puberty, or as the term male puberty is used, there is a scientific basis to them, because it is, when human beings diverge athletically is at the point of puberty, and there's little doubt of that anyone who has this rush of testosterone that occurs with puberty gains substantial advantages over anyone who doesn't. And that's the basis of why we have separate categories for men and women. But trans women aren't men, and trans women don't perform athletically like men. And so just saying that a trans woman who has experienced quote unquote male puberty, shouldn't be allowed in is overly simplistic, because all it's doing is looking at the science that separates men and women and not at the science that applies to trans athletes. And so it's been certainly a very unfortunate result of the IOC's policy that these very exclusive policies have been put in, and that while as I say, there is some scientific justification for setting a marking point at puberty. As you probably know, there are only a small amount of trans people who don't experience their natal puberty. And so while it doesn't exclude the entire trans population, it excludes the vast majority of the trans population. And so I don't think it's necessary. And let's say we take a sport that is one of the first to have done this, world aquatics. No trans woman has qualified for her nation's national team. No trans woman is close to qualifying for her nation's team. None have competed internationally. So this rule wasn't necessary because there were no trans women who were threatening international level aquatics, but was put in I think largely out of fear and frankly, largely out of the performance of Leah Thomas, who, while she won an NCAA Division I swim contest, is still far below the top American swimmers, female swimmers, and is not is no threat to make a U.S. team. So I think the IOC policy in summary was well intentioned, but it has had some very unfortunate consequences.
Yeah, I think as a follow-up, you made it clear like the intentions, behind the policy were good, and I have to agree with you, um, because clearly they prioritize inclusivity, and I think what they're trying to do is take into account the fact that different sports are going to require different advantages and disadvantages, and obviously that's going to mean different policies for different sports. But like we just discussed, it wasn't taken up quite in maybe the way that it was designed or intended by the actual sports governing bodies. So if you had been a part of that working group, is there anything that you would change maybe about the language or would have suggested that might have made it so that the sports governing bodies that follow IOC policy would have actually done so in a way that uh, is guided by the intention of the policy itself versus the unfortunate exclusionary policies that have been seeming to manifest from it?
The obviously hindsight is 2020,
Of course.
and it would be easy to go back and say, well, perhaps they should have done this differently.
For
But
sure.
I think that making as we did in 2015, making more concrete proposals are something that was more likely to be followed. But in truth, the political landscape has also changed a lot since then, and certainly in the U.S. and the U.K. and other places as well. Trans people have become the the uh, the um, the whipping children of many politicians who don't really care about sports, but are just trying to stir up their political base, and I think that's an unfortunate reality of the situation, and that would have occurred regardless of what the IOC came up with in 2021, and in fact had started to occur before then, and so what I've found is that scientists can be swayed by data, but politicians seldom are. Other than polling data or data that shows what their base would respond to, and so I think it's a sad reality that trans people in sports has become such a political issue over the last few years.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I mean, I also recall reading an article that was it was a joint article by a lot of people, stakeholders, and one of their accusation, or one of their, I would say, criticism of the IOC guidelines is that it kind of puts the burden on individual sport to make their own scientific evidence-based research on their own sport, without really giving them enough like resources, for instance, to conduct those available research. And I think a lot of this research, a lot of times I think one of those problems of a lot of these so-called scientific research that is done in individual sports conducted by individual governing bodies is that they often conflate trans women with cisgender men, right? And so assuming that they're always all the same, right? And I think your research and the research that was released just not long ago, actually emphasized that, trans women they're not just simply biological men, right? Of course, they undergo so-called male like physiology or, the puberty with the testosterone. We all agree that, testosterone actually plays a certain role in whatever sport, right? I mean, some sports have more, have a higher degree of influence, right? Some actually has much less, right? But then, the conflation of trans women and biological men is often very problematic to me. And what are your, maybe what are your observation? Do you see it as a problem as well? And what will be a better way of, conducting scientific research without conflating them together?
Yeah, I think certainly the study authors and Dr. Yanis Pitsalatis, who's done the media for this recently released study, has said over and over again that the most important thing to take from this study is that trans women don't have the same athletic capabilities as cis men, and I certainly agree that that's a very important aspect. And in my PhD dissertation, I don't know, it's within the first couple of paragraphs, I state very emphatically that trans women don't perform athletically like cis men. And so, yeah, I think it's a very important thing. And so if we are to make policies on trans athletes, we need data from trans athletes. And we shall see how this plays out over the next few years. As you may know, Leah Thomas has challenged the World Aquatics rules, and it will be very interesting to see what develops in that case. Certainly, Cass has previously said that if governing bodies create exclusionary policies, then the burden of proof lies with them to support their exclusionary policies. Now, that hasn't been proven. That hasn't been determined yet for transgender. It's other groups that have been. But if Cass follows their own precedent, then that would place the burden on World Aquatics to prove that trans women have an unfair advantage. And I think they would be hard pressed to meet that, but we shall see what happens. And so the case turns on both the science and then the legal question of who bears the burden of proof. And so, but I think that this case is very important, and I'm hopeful that it will provide a turning point, and that sports governing bodies will understand in the future that if they are to make policy on trans athletes, they need data from trans athletes. But that's that hasn't come to pass yet, and it may not come to pass. Courts are tricky things.
Yes, I totally agree that, the legal aspect we also have to consider. But back to the research that you have just mentioned, I think, I feel like there's an overwhelming emphasis, right, on trans women participation in the women's division, where a lot of times I feel like, as a trans masculine athlete myself, there is, it seems like there is a lack of concern, whether it's on scientific, on evidence-based research in general, or in the political realm where there is much less discussion on trans men or trans masculine folks competing in, let's say, the men's division or women's division or whatever division that is. Because there is often this assumption that if you were assigned female at birth, and then you have experienced quote unquote female puberty, then you will never be able to be as competitive as cis men, right? So based on your understanding, based on your research, what are your viewpoints on trans masculine and trans men participation in sports, and why is such a lack of concern and discussions around trans men athletes?
Well, it's certainly true that if a transmasculine individual has gone through his natal sex puberty, then he's got a lot of ground to make up if he's going to compete in the men's division. But certainly trans men have done so. Patricio Manuel is 3-1 as a professional boxer, and he just suffered his first defeat fairly recently.
Yes.
Skylar Baylor swam B1, and Chris Mosier has been a successful age group multi-sport athlete. So in the men's division, and so trans men certainly can compete. There's a study of fitness tests in U.S. personnel, and in that study, after a period of injecting testosterone, the trans men outperformed the cis men in the number of sit-ups per minute they could do. And so, this was an area in which, in a study, trans men outperformed cis men. I think that that there will be sports that will be very challenging for trans men, like the NBA, NFL, will be difficult sports. I think sports where, again, you have competition based on body mass. As I say, Patricio Manuel has shown that he can be pretty competitive. And so I think it's certainly true that the capabilities of trans men are underestimated, but it is certainly true that there is a substantial amount of catching up to do if a trans man has experienced puberty in his natal sex.
Sorry, go ahead, Steve. I saw you about to say something.
No, I was just thinking about, that's true. That's very true too, because as we discussed earlier, we discussed how, individual sport, different sports actually requires, different types of strength and different degree of so-called strength. How no matter how you define strength itself, right? And it reminds us a lot about our trans bodybuilders, right? Where a lot of times, a lot of these trans bodybuilders do compete, trans masculine bodybuilders do compete in the men's division. And, a lot of them also get really, really great results, winning in their own divisions against other cis men, right? And in a sport where, we are looking into, the visuality of the body, about the proportion, symmetry, stuff like that, that is not traditionally defined by how much weight you actually lift at the gym. So I think, those are sports where, there are actually some leeway to think about, the effects of testosterone, and then whether it is the only thing that influence our performances.
Well, I think it's also benefited by the fact that they're weight class individual sports, like Joanna mentioned before, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you're a basketball player, you have to usually, like, it's going to benefit you to be really tall and play on a team, but like with bodybuilding and powerlifting, like your weight is taken into account when grouping the athletes and comparing people together. And so that does kind of make it so that even if you're a smaller individual, you still have the capacity to win and outperform even cis competitors in that same weight class. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and at the same time, it also reminds me of how not all it's not always bigger, heavier, and and stronger, as the advantage in every sport, right? So, for example, in my field research in Taiwan, where I was looking into a bodybuilding competition that does divide competitors according to competition attires rather than their gender. So there's a bikini division where whatever gender you are, you just wear bikini, and there is and then you have like the physique, where they wear beach shorts, and then you have one that is a combination of wearing a sports bra and a beach shorts. And in the bikini division, there were half of them were cis men, just having fun and trying to compete in the bikinis division, and most of them don't win. mostly because, there is a particular criteria on, let's say, the muscularity of that division where, in those division, competitors are not expected to be too muscular. So they have to maintain, a balance of their physique or whatever. And so a lot of times, it is not just about, being more muscular, being bigger, will always have that advantage, right? As, whether you are a trans feminine athlete or a trans woman athlete. So I think, we also have to take into account that, this argument, this assumption that trans women always have better advantages physiologically because, they were once men, so-called. I think that is just a misconception in a large extent of way. And yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, do you have anything you want to say, Joanna? I was going to ask a
Well, one of
follow-up
the things
question.
that I would like to say too is that, we've talked almost exclusively about physiological aspects that lead to success in sport. And one of the most important things, however, is also the athlete's mental state. And for instance, in women's tennis, something we've seen fairly recently, Naomi Osaka is one of the most talented women's tennis players in the world. And yet, she has suffered through a period where her results have been subpar because of mental health issues. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. But it is certainly true that the trans population as a whole suffers from poorer mental health than the cis population. And that is disadvantageous in so many areas of life, including sports. And that needs to be taken into account as well.
And also culturally, like, trans people just have much more, we have to think about not just about, thriving in the sport, right? In the sport that we love, but just being able to survive on a day-to-day basis, right? As a trans person, right? I think those, whether it takes on an emotional toll or, the mental health issue, it's at the same time, it's also, very, just very substantial physical material that whether we are able to have access to the sport that we love, right? And I think those are, those are not really being taken into account of, right? And we, I think those who are, saying that trans women are always going to be, dominating in the women's sports, really neglect those other aspects that influence how sports itself is, as we always said, inherently unfair.
Yes.
Right. And I think, really just taking about the physiological and especially the testosterone as the only indicator will be really problematic and really reductive, as what Joanna, you just earlier mentioned.
Yeah. I would like to start kind of wrapping up our last maybe two questions and then some audience questions just to respect your time, Joanna, because I know it's been a little while.
I think you can just start. I think you can just work with the audience questions.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I did want to ask just like, I don't know, Joanna, if you know about how we structure our divisions as an organization. We very loosely base our divisions on your original research back on trans women runners, because at the time it was basically the only thing that existed on trans athletes. And so our divisions are a combination of the athlete's gender expression as well as their assigned gender at birth and whether or not they've been on HRT consistently for 1 year. And that's how, and then we allow athletes to self-select into those divisions based on where they feel they are on those criteria. Now, obviously, that was research done on anaerobic sport, on trans women, and our sports have more to do with muscle accrual and retention and 1 rep max strength and anaerobic capacity. So I'm wondering, maybe you don't have any opinions on this, but based on the newer research that does exist, do you think that that is still like a relatively fair criteria, or do you think that there's room for adjustment there on how we structure our divisions?
Well, I think that any policy on trans athletes needs to be considered a living document.
Yes, it is.
And to change with time. So I think that what you're doing is reasonable given the data that exists now. Will it be a reasonable policy 10 years from now? That's a much harder thing to say. But, As I say, I hope that in the next 5 to 10 years, there are several papers that come out from, as I say, the stuff that we have completed at Loughborough. I know the group at Brighton has another study that they want to push out. And I know that other groups around the world are starting to look at these questions. And so, I'm hopeful that more data will come out. I think your policy is perfectly reasonable for now, but don't consider it a policy forever.
No, it absolutely was designed as a living document, and we both are interested in keeping up to date on what research comes out, and we also survey our athletes regularly to see if there's anything that we can do to shift it to make it more affirming for them as well. So I appreciate that answer. So yeah, we did have a couple of questions come in before, like during the week when we were advertising from our audience. So we had one question from Jabri, and they asked, do the sports agencies that you work with who come to you for your, consultation and collaboration in developing their policies, do they usually actually take heed to your advice and the research that you've done or that you're familiar with, or do they tend to be more resistant? And you don't need to call out any specific agencies at all. We're just curious if it's generally been a positive experience for you overall.
It's generally been a positive experience, but that doesn't mean that I necessarily get the results that I would like. Let's take, for example, World Athletics. I have been working with them since 2015. And while I disagree with their most recent policy on trans athletes, I have a lot of respect for people within the organization. And, I certainly wouldn't throw away 8 years of cooperation with them just because I disagree with their most recent policy. And I was part of the scientific working group on that policy. And, while I hope to be part of the group that changes their mind on that, I don't think, I don't think that it's reasonable to expect that in a group decision, the decision will always go the way of any one individual in that group. And that is as true for me as it is anyone else in the group. And some of the sports governing bodies don't bring me in, some do. And the ones who don't bring me in usually wind up with more exclusionary policies, but even sometimes the ones that do bring me in wind up with that. But I think you have to respect the process and the fact that there are multiple other people in the room and stakeholders, and you just have to respect that and be willing to work with people even if the result doesn't go your way.
I mean, that's great. I love that, respecting the process. That's so important. So yeah, thank you for that. And then another question, it's a two-part question from Nate, specifically to do with the research, the body of research that exists. He asks, how can trans athletes participate in research studies about trans athletes or advocate for its importance? And then the other question is, what barriers exist in preventing more research on trans athletes being done? So how can they participate, and what barriers exist for that research actually to occur?
Well, I can tell you that when I was at Loughborough, I did a lot of recruiting. And I tried as hard as I could to get as many. Now, at the time, the laboratory studies had to be people in the UK. Moving forward, I would, encourage groups, like yourselves to stay in contact with researchers. Certainly myself, Blair Hamilton, who's moving, who also finished her doctorate and is moving from Brighton to Manchester, and you know, I don't know what her new academic email address is, but she's certainly active on social media and can be reached that way. Uh, that would be a good place to start for people who want to be involved. And you know, I'm certainly hopeful that that there will be more lab-based studies, and there haven't been any in the U.S. yet, and I'm hopeful that will happen in the not too distant future. Uh, There are certainly in powerlifting, in Olympic weightlifting, as I say, you can be anywhere in the world and send us your results, especially if you lifted prior to transition. And I'm, you know, very always interested in seeing data. I don't have a study open currently, but will there be another study? I certainly hope so, and you know, I absolutely encourage people to be willing to share their data.
Awesome. That's really good to hear, and it's good to hear that we as an organization can have a part to play in connecting researchers to potential athletes that can participate in the studies. So that's definitely something I'm interested in supporting. And thank you for that. The very last question that we had was from someone named Seven. They asked, any advice for someone interested in pursuing a PhD in the realm of studying trans/non-binary athletic physical activities? So just advice on getting into the field, basically doing what you're doing.
Yeah, well, I can't promise, but because the programs that are doing this are few and far between. Mm-hmm. You know, it depends on their time frame. As I say, I'm hopeful that there will be another U.S. or a U.S. based program in the not too distant future, but we shall see how that goes. I would probably rather deal with that on an individual basis. My obviously people have my Instagram address, but probably the best way of reaching me is through my university address, which you can feel free to share with anyone there who wants to reach me either as a potential researcher or as a potential research subject. And I'm always willing to hear from other trans athletes.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Did you have something you want to say, Sifung, so we can close out? Or unfortunately, the video did end at 90 minutes because we took about 30 minutes just to set up the call and get everybody on. So yeah, hopefully y'all enjoyed the conversation. We were basically done with all of our questions for Joanna anyway. And we will be putting her contact information out there for y'all who are interested in talking to her about potentially being research subjects or getting any support on becoming, getting your PhD and becoming a researcher. And all of our technical difficulties aside, we do appreciate everybody who hopped on, supported us, cheered us on while we got through the technical difficulties, who stayed through the whole call. And if you enjoyed at least the meat of the conversation, the primary bit of the conversation that we were able to talk to Dr. Harper about, we would appreciate your support in any way. We are a nonprofit organization. Our goal is basically just to break even in order to, put on these events that we have every year for our trans athletes. And the best ways that you can support us are by becoming an official IATBP member, which you can do through our website. And there is a post at the top of our feed that tells you how to become a member for $49 a year. Very, very reasonable membership fee. And with that membership, you get a free t-shirt and you get the opportunity to compete with us in the future. Although you do not have to be an athlete planning on competing with us in order to become a member. So anybody can become a member just to support us. And you can also buy a t-shirt from us to support us as well if you're not interested in paying that $49 a year. You can also donate directly to us, or you can come and actually support the athletes in November this year. You can buy your tickets when they come out to watch the bodybuilding show or the powerlifting meet, and fly out to Atlanta and support our athletes in person, which would be really awesome. So yeah, once again, thank you so much for staying with us through all of the technical difficulties, and we're incredibly sorry for any frustration that it might have caused. And we will be looking into how to ensure that it does not happen again next time. So don't worry, it will definitely be a better experience on that front in the future. But yeah, thank you everybody. And yeah, hopefully we will see you at the next Fireside Chat. So keep an eye out on our Instagram feed for an announcement on when that's going to be.